Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, it's a particular pleasure to have a chance to talk to Dick Smethurst, who I've known for a few years, and I always start, Dick, by asking when and where the person I'm interviewing was born. So.
I was born in Chipping Norton, just outside Banbury, and more between Banbury and Oxford, in January 1941, 17th of January.
So you're older than me. I was born in December 1941. People like to, often fill in their ancestry. Some go back, Sir John Gurdon went back to the Norman Conquest, but some only go back to their grandparents or whatever. Can you sketch in a little bit of your family?
Yes, sure. Well, what we were doing in the Banbury area is that my father was general manager and kind of chief engineer of a small electrical firm. I suppose nowadays you'd call it an electronics firm, but I think it was before there were things called electronics, called Switchgear and Equipment. My father was an electrical and mechanical engineer. He left school. He was at school at Walsall Grammar School in the Black Country, and he served his apprenticeship at the Daimler Car Company in Coventry, where his apprentice master was my mother's father. So that's how they met.
I think marrying the boss's daughter.
Well, not quite the boss, because he was obviously a very skilled toolmaker. My father always had.
If you can, as much as possible, look at me. I know we've faced you that way.
My father always had very great admiration for my mother's father, and he was a skilled toolmaker. So he wasn't quite a boss. He was, I suppose you'd say now, he was I think he would be a skilled artisan. My mother also was kind of connected to my father because she had piano lessons from my father's eldest sister, who was a piano teacher, also in Coventry. So there's a kind of Coventry link in their lives together, though my mother was actually born not in the Black Country, but further west in Hereford. And I don't quite know how or when her family came to the Coventry area. So that's my parents. My father came from a very large family of 13 children who survived, and there were 2 or 3 others who didn't survive infancy. Their father was called chief clerk of, I suppose he would be now senior administrator of, a large mental hospital outside Lichfield at a place called Burntwood. And they were a very interesting, somewhat disputatious family. And there were, by the time I was aware of them, there was a big rift in the family between the eldest brother, who lived in Birmingham and himself had 5 or 6 children, and my father, who was the youngest boy. And the rift, I think, was over whether the elder brother, unlike all the other brothers, had contributed to my grandmother's upkeep, since my grandfather, the hospital administrator, had died when my father was 14, which would have been in 1915, 1916, something of that kind. I don't know what of. He was obviously a multi-talented man, at least by the accounts of his family. They recount him playing 2 or 3 different musical instruments and so on. But more interesting to me as a child were their stories of their childhood together. In particular, an uncle, though I never met him, called Dick, And for that reason, my mother never ever called me Dick. I was always Richard to her, because my mother was a reasonably simple soul. She'd been a bookkeeper when she was employed. She had a kind of view that if she called me Dick, I would turn out to be like Dick. He was sent to Canada for some misdeed before World War One. One can only guess what the misdeed was, but when one of my aunts died about 20 years ago now, perhaps more, we found in her possessions a postcard from Liverpool to his mother, with a picture of a White Star liner on the picture side, and a thing saying, "Dear Mother, I'm about to embark on leaving the old life, about to embark for a happier one on other shores," or something like that. And interestingly enough, a few years later, when one of my other aunts died, we found in her belongings a photograph of a small child, a mounted photograph, not in a frame, but mounted. And my elder daughter, with the sort of sharp eyes of a 12-year-old little girl, said, "I'm sure that's the same handwriting as on the postcard." And we compared them, and indeed it was. And because all these aunts all died intestate, none of them leaving very much money, but 2,000 or 3,000, we had to try and trace this child to see whether it was entitled to any money. And indeed my solicitor did, but unfortunately never divulged to me the names and addresses of these relatives through Uncle Dick. And so I missed the chance to write to them saying, "P.S. do you have any idea what your grandfather did to be sent to Canada?" So that he was a really colourful character, and lots of lovely stories about him, including one. All the boys went to Queen Mary's Grammar School, Walsall, and there's a story that he was set to write 2,000 lines as a punishment, and set his brothers and sisters to do it for him. And they were, as it were, engaged in a line writing factory when in came Father, as they called my grandfather, who saw what was going on and ripped up all the lines. Nothing daunted, Dick goes to school the following morning and produces the ripped up lines to the schoolteacher. And the schoolteacher says, "What's this?" And he says, "My father does not approve of setting lines." And apparently got away with it. So he's a man of considerable charm and considerable roguery.
Lovely. What were your parents like? I mean, as you mentioned, your mother as quite a simple soul, but their characters and how that might have influenced you.
Well, I admired my father hugely, but because not long after I was born, only 6 months after I was born, he volunteered. He was too old to be called up for World War II, but he volunteered and went into the Indian Army and was in IEME, the Indian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, largely mending tanks and so on for service in Burma, as far as I can gather. I didn't really know my father. I can vividly, if you were a psychotherapist, you could make something of this, which I can vividly remember my father being rather nice letters and pictures on the letters that he had sent, and also an uncompleted model railway engine which he had started to build for me when I was about a week old, I suppose, which lay on a shelf uncompleted. But when my father was demobbed, I remember desperately pleaded with my mother not to kiss him on the station. And I can equally remember being picked up by this person wearing a rather smart army uniform with a, Sam Brown thing and so on, and great offence to my dignity being put on his shoulders and walked to the back of the train to the luggage van to get his stuff and so on. So my father I admired greatly, but we had quite a difficult relationship in many, many ways. He was immensely competent at anything to do with his hands. He had gone through, as I said, apprenticeship as a mechanical engineer and night school, and passed all the examinations for the associate membership of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, and similarly he did the same thing for electrical engineers. So he was one of that generation of people who nowadays would obviously have gone to university and so on, but didn't. As a result, he was entirely unimpressed by universities. He thought they were something some people might go to, but and I vividly remember ringing home after I got my school's results and saying I've got a first, and my father said, "Oh, that's good," and then moved on the conversation to something else. And it was years and years later when I actually dared to tackle him about this, and it turned up my elder cousin had been to Cambridge and got a first at St Catherine's, funnily enough. So my father, an observation of two of people going to Oxford or Cambridge, both of whom got firsts, thought that there were lots and lots of firsts, and, and had no idea that he was supposed to say, "Wow, well done," and so on, which wounded me greatly. So we had an uneasy relationship, and he's still with me whenever I try and do any kind of DIY job, because I hear his voice over my shoulder saying, "Never use a nail, always use a screw," or "That's not straight," or whatever. And he reminds us a Jack Dee sketch of a cat and a dog watching their master put a shelf up, and the dog saying, "I think you're so wonderful, it's absolutely marvellous you can put a shelf up. My goodness, how incredible it is you can use a saw." And the cat saying, "It's not straight. It won't bear the weight." So my father has that voice always. And indeed, only when he was dying of liver cancer, and we spent some quality time together in a way right at the end of his life, we talked through some issues we had together, and that was good. So that's my father. He was a complicated character. He, as I say, he was very, very handy in every way. He had a slow-burning fuse temper. He could maintain a grudge for 40, 50 years without any difficulty with his elder brother. My mother had a much more kind of volcanic temper, which is much more like mine. That is, it goes to a pitch in about 4 minutes and then subsides just as quickly, which leaves lots of other people extremely confused, because you're not at all cross with them 8 minutes later, and they are still, as it were, smarting from the effect.
I mean, anticipating greatly, do you think you cultivated that volcanic temper in ruling this college? No,
I've tried very much to keep it under control, because if you remotely lose your temper, I can remember doing it 3 times in governing body meetings, and each time I've hugely regretted it later. So no, I try hard not to. But it doesn't stop me kicking the cat afterwards.
Well, except it goes against your theory, because the volcano should have subsided.
Yeah, well, then I can recreate it afterwards.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
No, only child.
Okay.
But lots and lots and lots of cousins, because of this big family. So Christmas times and so on, there were a small semi-detached house just outside Banbury. Was always full of family and numerous beds in the same bedroom and so on.
What was your first memory? I mean, it doesn't. Sometimes they're sort of half things that you've been told that you are not the sort of trees waving over the pram memory, but something quite specific.
Well, I don't know what is first. There are a group of memories. When my father went into the army, my mother moved from our little house in a village called Bloxham, which is just outside Banbury, to live with his unmarried sisters called Barbara and Ruth, who were then living in the house with their mother, their widowed mother, in Bodicote, just outside Banbury. And fairly soon after I was born, my grandmother died. So there were my mother and my two maiden aunts. And the house had kind of chain wire, if you know what I mean, that sort of diamond pattern of wire that nowadays you don't really see because it tends to be covered with plastic, but in those days was just wire between it and the next door neighbours. And an early memory is of the next door neighbour on one side, Mr. Cross, who kept ferrets. And I can remember being terrified of these awful creatures, these ferrets. So that's one memory. I can also remember going down to the village duck pond and feeding the ducks. And this must be in my first 3 or 4 years, because when the war came to an end, despite the fact that Coventry had been blitzed terribly, my mother wanted to go back to Coventry to get out of the rather poisonous atmosphere of these two maiden aunts who disliked each other greatly. And so we moved to Coventry when I was, let's think, 5, just before I was 5, I think. So these memories of Banbury must be in my first 3 or 4 years.
Where was your first school? In Coventry?
Yes, my mother had an elder sister in Coventry, the only kind of reasonably rich relative I've ever had. My mother was one of 3 girls. The middle girl was killed in a road traffic accident when she was quite young, I think about 14 or so, by, gosh, this takes you back, a runaway horse and cart. So there was my mother's elder sister, Violet, and my mother herself, whose name was Nora. And her mother died, I think, when she was about 11 or 12, rather like my father's father dying when he was 14. And so she was really brought up by this elder sister, Violet. And Auntie Vi married somebody who had a chain of optician shops in the Coventry, Kenilworth, Warwick kind of area. So we went to Coventry pretty well as soon as it was safe to do so, really. And that's where my father came back to when he came out of the army.
And you went to school there. Do you remember your first school?
Yeah, it was Coventry Preparatory School, and the reason I went there, sorry, I've lost the thread. The reason I went there is because my rich aunt had sent her son there.
It was a preparatory school. That's to say, it was from about the age of 8 or.
No. It was called CPS, but it had a kind of very junior. I didn't go till I was 5.
So it was a kindergarten, really.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, I seem to remember doing something quite serious in the way of schoolwork and so on. And then when we moved to Liverpool, because during the war my father had met in his IEME unit somebody called Tony Ferry, who was one of the sugar making families which amalgamated eventually to make the big sugar firm Tate and Lyle. And you probably won't remember, I hardly remember, there were things called fairy cubes at one stage, cube figures, but it wasn't fairy with a Y, it was fairy IE, F-A-I-R-R-I-E. And Tony Fairy was my father's, I think he was colonel, my father was a major in the Indian Army, and thought highly of my father. And when the war ended, there was a vacancy for a chief engineer brackets construction in the Tate and Lyle sugar refinery in Liverpool. And so my father was offered the job, really, I think, on Tony Fairy's say-so. And I remember that his first task was actually to design an internal power station, a turbine hall for the reconstruction of the Tate and Lyle refinery in the extraordinarily named Love Lane in Liverpool. So after 2 terms at Coventry Preparatory School, we all decamped and went up to Liverpool, and I went to Rudston Road County Primary School, which was the local primary school.
Around this time, some people begin to develop little hobbies which they keep on through their lives, like stealing birds' eggs or stamp collecting or some little passion, fishing or something like this. Do you remember anything from about this age which began to grip you?
Yeah, I was probably conditioned by that early, as it were, token, as you anthropologists might call it, of my father, the model railway engine. I was passionately interested in model railways.
Electric or?
Electric, yes. And then
double O?
Hornby double O, yes, exactly so, with the 3-rail system, if you remember that, and so on, yeah. And I think I spent more time planning a model railway than actually doing it.
Did you paint your own carriages?
That sort of thing, yes, exactly. And I used to like making model trees out of wire and wire wool and things like that, and painting them.
And you had your whole, your room, you were allowed to have this round your bedroom.
That came rather later, but I did have a big model railway set, yes, I did. It never worked terribly well, I have to say. It looked quite pretty.
Do you remember any of the teachers from that sort of preparatory?
From the preparatory school? Not from the preparatory school. I do remember, I remember, the only memory I have of the Coventry Preparatory School is playing a game of football in which I got confused about which goal I was supposed to be kicking the ball into. And I seem to remember scoring at both ends. But when I went to Rudston Road County Primary School, I think I can remember most of them. I can remember Miss Pilo, who was the first teacher in the first form, and I can remember later on Miss Cowley, who had to deal with a class of, I think I remember, it was 49 in the class. And she lost her temper very regularly. She was a terrifying lady when she lost her temper. And this was I suppose I must have left when I was about 10, in what was the year before people did the 11 plus. And I can remember that that we had kind of form orders. This is a state primary school, but we still did. And I think I was not absolutely always, but usually top of the boys. But I think there were 7 girls who were ahead of me in the order, and almost all of those won things called Margaret Bryce scholarships, which were offered by Liverpool County Education Authority to go to the grammar schools in the city.
Why did you leave before 11 plus?
Because I went to a place called Liverpool College, which is a minor public school, and I think I went there for a variety of reasons. I think my father was a strong conservative supporter. I can't now remember. Some phrase that Aneurin Bevan used in talking about the Conservatives at some meeting or other, where he called them vermin, and there was a sort of badge that you wore called the Vermin Club, I think. I don't think I'm making this up. Anyways, my father proudly wore one of these things. I think he was getting better paid and wanted to put the money into his son's education. I think they were partly influenced by the nephew of our next door neighbours who went to Liverpool College and who seemed a nicely mannered and charming young boy.
This was a day school.
This was there is a boarding. It still is. I'm a honorary life governor. There is a boarding house, but it was, well, I would guess, 3/4 day.
And you were a day boy.
I was a day boy. Yeah.
And you didn't have to take a common entrance or anything?
You had to take an entrance exam, but it wasn't common entrance. It was at 10 rather than 13 or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. That school you continued at until
I came here. Absolutely.
Well, tell me more about that school. I mean, were there any really important teachers who influenced your life?
Yes, very, extremely important teacher. The vice master of the whole school, the headmaster of the junior school, was a man called Harold Lickes.
How do you spell that?
Lickes. Who was a formidable disciplinarian, but also a formidable grammarian. And he taught us English grammar in the most precise way. So by the age of 11 or so, we were doing the analysis of compound complex sentences. And one of the ploys he used was to take letters that parents had written him and write them up on the board. Usually letters parents had written trying to excuse their boys from games. And this had a wonderful effect. One is it improved one's grammar, and the second is it dissuaded one from ever asking one's parents to write a letter to get you off games, for fear that the letter would appear on the board, much to your humiliation. So he was a major influence, and if my wife was here, she would tell you that I'm a formidable proofreader and reader of her articles, and when I put in the margin, as I sometimes do, though she does it less now, UGH,
yes.
And then MP for misrelated participle. This is going straight back to those formative years with Mr. Lickes. So he was one major influence. Then there was an extraordinary man who has only recently died, called Roxburgh, who had won the George, whichever, or the civilian one, whichever the military one is, the George Medal or something like that, in the war. Actually not, as it were, on active service, but when training a group of soldiers. One of them had thrown a grenade and it had rolled back into the trench they were practicing from, and he had picked it up in order to throw it away, and it had blown both his arms off. So he had two tin arms, which he nevertheless contrived to maneuver in the most extraordinary way. So he had really, really beautiful handwriting on a blackboard with chalk, really amazing. he was very, very kind, very inspirational teacher, but also pretty harsh disciplinarian. I can remember fooling around in the lunch queue one day and suddenly literally seeing stars because he'd thumped me on the back of my head with one of his tin arms.
What did he teach?
Well, he was a modern linguist, but he taught geography and English, and I don't think primary school teachers in those days were particularly specialised.
Well, this isn't a primary school, this is.
No, but if you see what I mean,
yeah. Were you beginning to gravitate towards arts and humanities side rather than science?
Well, the school was pretty weak on science, I think. I was never very much good at mathematics, which irritated
As
my
an
father.
economist.
Because he was. No, I'm an economist entirely by accident. I'm an entirely bogus economist. No, my father was a very good mathematician, but I wasn't. Yeah, I suppose writing English and that kind of thing came relatively easily to me, and remembering, we had to learn chunks of poetry and so on, that sort of thing.
And that was what you liked most?
Yeah.
English and
English, history, Latin, but the arts subjects or humanities subjects.
And were you still doing well? I mean, you were...
Yeah.
It wasn't a mixed school, I mean, it was just boys.
Boys only.
So you were nearer the top.
Yes, I was at the top.
What about games? You didn't get your letters to get you off it, but did you enjoy any?
Yeah, I did. I enjoyed games. I'm afraid I had an entirely successful and entirely happy school time. I think I mean, I know you went to a much more rigorous independent school than I did, but in the kind of school I went to, if you fortunately mature at the same rate that you're supposed to, you kind of enjoy it. Now, one of my great friends who was, sometimes beat me, we had fortnightly orders, if you can believe this. All the marks added up from all the things you did, and you changed places in the classroom. If you were the top of the class, you were in the back left-hand corner as looked at from the teacher's desk. And you then shuffled round every fortnight in accordance with the fortnightly order. And I was usually sitting next to one of two people, one of whom became professor of marine biology at Exeter University and is a distinguished marine biologist. He didn't mature at the right rate. He matured too fast and consequently really didn't like the school. And there was somebody else who was a very, very fine mathematician who got a scholarship to Brasenose the same year I came here to Worcester and became senior maths master eventually at Lancaster Royal Grammar School. But thinking of him now, I think he was certainly dyslexic, because his maths was wonderful, but he couldn't make any headway in any subject requiring you to write English or French or whatever. And he didn't have a happy time in the school either, but others of us did. And I did.
When you say mature at the right rate, I mean, is this sexual maturity?
No, I think it's just are you irritated by silly rules and regulations? If you are, then I mean, the sort of silly rule and regulation, I'm sure you had them at Sedbo, as the kind of thing that you were allowed to wear brown shoes, but only after you were 15, and you were not allowed to walk across on a shortcut across the main rugby pitch until you were in the lower sixth, and that sort of thing. And some people get extremely irritated by that and deliberately walk across the pitch or wear brown shoes and are therefore punished for it. And it gets into a kind of spiral of pettifogging regulations, really. I mean, I blush when I think of enforcing them, but I did.
Because you were a prefect?
I was, yes.
Right. What about other things you were interested in at school? I mean, did you acting? No, all those. I joined in everything, I'm afraid. Yeah, I was.
I eventually, I mean, I played all sport. I played rugby. I began by being able to run faster than anybody else in my year, so I started on the wing, and gradually they got faster and I got slower, so I moved inwards. I broke my ankle playing for the probables against the possibles in the final trial for the first 15, which then wrecked my chances of ever playing for the first 15, which I greatly regretted. And the same break in the ankle took me through into the first term of serious hockey, and there I played occasionally for the first 11, but not actually regularly for it. And in cricket, I never made it into the first 11, but I was a regular second 11 player, and indeed ended up captaining all 3 second 11s of this, or second 11 hockey and cricket, and second 15 rugby. So, and I had my house colours and all that sort of thing. So I did that, and I acted. I broke another bone by falling off the stage when acting, and I sang. We had a choral society, which I was very keen on, and I also played the piano.
Do you still play the piano?
Very badly and very occasionally when nobody else is listening.
But coming to music, I mean, which is often quite a strong theme through many people's lives, has it been important?
Yeah, I think it has in a way. Yes, it is a strong theme. I mean, in later life, I've been trustee of something called the European Community Baroque Orchestra for about 10 years. I'm a university appointed trustee of a thing called the Oxford Philharmonic, which is the sort of top professional orchestra in Oxford. Yeah, no, music is important to me. I'm keen on encouraging the college musical activities, and I think they would recognise that. So yeah.
Does it? I mean, some people are quite. Music integrates into their work in the sense that they either use it as a way to relax from work, or even listen to music when they're working, or listen to music and then are inspired by it and do something. Can you see any way in which it's interlinked with your professional?
No, I don't like music on when I'm studying or doing something serious. I can't do with that, I'm afraid. When I do listen to music, I either listen to it properly in a concert, or alternatively, the time when I do have it on as kind of background, I'm afraid, is when cooking, which is something I've developed over the last 20 years and greatly enjoy doing. So, yeah, I listen to it then a lot as background, but I don't like it as background if I'm working.
I don't know whether you had this, but I now realise that an important part of our lives was the CCF, Combined Cadet Force, and training for some war that we were about to fight, which fortunately didn't materialise, but undoing Bren guns and this kind of field days and so on. Did you have all this?
I'm afraid so, Alan, and I'm afraid I was very good at it, and I was
you were going to be good at
best cadet and ended up as senior company sergeant major, and we had a centenary parade while I was the senior CSM to celebrate the centenary of the foundation of Liverpool College Cadet Force, and I got great delight out of training a squad to do drill without commands, which I remember being very impressed by. So there was a Royal Air Force regiment squad which did drill without commands, and it's quite difficult to do because people have to count. I suppose it's got a sort of musical bit to it, and I remember training a squad of boys to do it, and we did it, and it worked very well. So yeah, all that, you know, I look back on my school, and I did pretty well everything.
You did everything, and also you're painting yourself as someone who never challenged anything very deeply.
No, I didn't.
You were never a rebel.
I was not a rebel. I absolutely was not.
And likewise in politics. I mean, your father was.
I don't think I had any particular political views, actually.
You didn't belong to any club or.
No. We debated. There was a debating society, which I enjoyed doing, but no. Not really. I mean, curiously, when you think about it, because talking about the CCF, I remember we were on a CCF camp. Maybe you were as well. There was a huge CCF camp at Thetford in Norfolk, which we went to in the August of 1956. And I can remember, we were sent home early because the troops were mustering to go and invade Suez. And secondly, I can remember them, even while we were there were sort of green tanks that were being repainted in sand and other livery. I mean, the notion that we were keeping secret the fact that we were going to invade Suez is really a bit ridiculous.
And one thing I've discovered from looking at those years was 57, 58 was very important for me because I got involved with skiffle and pop music, and this was a time of Lonnie Donegan, Elvis Presley, Bill Haley. Were you affected by any of that, being in Liverpool?
No, well, only very indirectly. Richard Stilgoe was at my school and was a year behind me. But we acted together in a couple of plays, and so I was aware, as it were, of skiffle and pop groups and so on.
Because this is Liverpool. I mean,
this is Liverpool. Yeah, but you see, the Beatles don't really emerge until the early '60s. I mean,
right.
as I think, Richard Stilgoe has said somewhere, he had a group called Tony Snow and the something or others, I can't remember, which I think was kind of a rival at one stage to the nascent Beatles, who hadn't by that stage acquired Ringo Starr or whatever. So,
But so it was just on the edges of your world.
Yeah, it was on the edges of my world, but it was classical music I was interested in, and the Choral Society obviously did classical music. For a couple of years, with a great friend of mine from school, we had season tickets for the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra, and I used to go there every fortnight. Rather than pop music, I was trying to educate myself, for some reason I can't really remember, into understanding or liking what one perhaps might call modern music. John Pritchard was the chief conductor of the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic. It wasn't the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic, just the Liverpool Phil at the time. And there was a series of concerts called Musica Viva, which were concerned with modern music. And there would be an explanation of the piece either before it was played or after it was played, and so on. So I was experimenting with music, but not in the pop direction. And I still don't greatly like pop music.
The other thing that happened around this age in the maturing process is communion and being confirmed and so on, and often a sort of religious questioning of to be in the early part of your life. Did this happen to you?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, in the school we went to chapel every morning, and the Bishop of Manchester, as he now is, Nigel McCulloch, was in my class. Usually one of the organists or people, organ scholars. They weren't called organ scholars, but he was one of the organists. Chapel was a regular part of my life. I hadn't been christened. My father, according to my mother anyway, had had a period of great religious intensity in the 1920s. I should have said that my parents were engaged for 13 or 14 years before they got married, neither of them feeling they had enough money to marry, and each of them looking after a lone parent. My mother was quite keen on religion. I wouldn't say she was active, but she went to church sometimes. My father never did. So I hadn't been christened, but I did confirmation classes at school, and I was christened, I think, the night before I was confirmed.
And how has it been since? I mean, what
well, both my wives have kept me on the straight and narrow. I mean, my first wife, Joan, ended up as chief social worker for the Diocese of Oxford. And Sue, of course, is fellow and tutor in theology here and is a licensed lay reader and so on. And the house that I'm going to retire to in 9 months' time is about 30 meters from the St. Barnabas Church. And I strongly suspect I'm going to be swept up by the vicar to be the to be the parish treasurer. But although it's not a church that is absolutely to my taste in terms of the point on the candle, as they say, it's much too high church for my liking. But I, straightforward Anglican, believe in the parish church system, so we'll go to my parish church until it really infuriates me. It may infuriate Sue, because she obviously feels very strongly about the ordination of women and about there being women bishops, and the current incumbent of the church is, what should I say, a less forthright supporter of that than she would hope.
So you're straight down the middle,
I'm
C of E.
straight down the middle, C of E, absolutely, yes.
No doubts ever?
Oh gosh, doubts all the time, absolutely. Hopeless, yes. Sue will tell you that if she stands next to me close enough to hear, I say different bits of the creed every week, because I find I can't believe in this bit this week. Yeah, huge doubts. I'm terrified of death, absolutely terrified of death, really. I mean, you were talking about pop music. When my children were young, my elder son, now a hotshot city lawyer earning 10 times what I do, am I cross? Yes. He was at your distinguished college. He was at King's. He had a penchant for a pop group called the Smiths, I think, and some of the lyrics from their songs, I seem to remember it's the Smiths one, which says, "I know that when I die I shall find that God has a sick sense of humour," and I think that's probably right.
So it's the fear of death in the...
All that, yes, yeah, I imagine that's part of it.
And what about all the kind of... Oxford is the centre of the Dawkins sphere. Science and so on has disproved it all stuff.
I mean, it seems to me... Well, I mean, I'm always interested in that sort of stuff. Do you remember when Alec Graham was chaplain here, there was a thing called the Woodruff Society, and I remember doing a paper for the Woodruff Society about whether we can speak meaningfully of religion, i.e. the sort of logical positivist and subsequent philosophers' view that metaphysical language was literally contentless because you can't falsify it. I was very impressed when I read The Selfish Gene. Thought it was also a superb excuse for all kinds of selfish male behaviour.
Fitted with a certain kind of capitalist
yes,
individualism.
indeed. I mean, it is that sort of stuff. I think if you were to interview Dawkins, you may have done so for this. I suspect that Dawkins' more shrill attack on religion in recent years is either quite a good publicity stunt, or alternatively, and this is possibly more likely, Dawkins fighting against his father, because I think his father was a priest, I think.
That's interesting.
So No, I don't have those kind of doubts. I mean, it seems to me there are so many doubts about the whole thing. And of course, Sue's specialism is the Hebrew Bible. So one of the things that she very much, what's the word I want, stresses in her own Anglicanism is the continuity with Judaism. But I enjoy teasing her about it too. I don't take it all that seriously. I mean, for example, we have wonderful debates about whether the Garden of Eden was the most appalling confidence trick, because you say to any child, don't touch that. What is the absolute certainty when you go out the room? They'll touch it.
God's sinister sense of humour too.
Absolutely.
But it meant that being head of an Anglican college, there was no particular stress between
No. I mean, the more I go on, the more I feel I'm a Benedictine abbot.
Which you are. Very nice. Well, let's come on to Oxford then. I nearly said Cambridge, Oxford. We came up in the same term 50 years ago, more or less today. And you came up to read, I'm assuming Innocence. I know more than I. So what did you read when you...
Well, I read PPE, but I had failed ignominiously the previous year to get into corpus to read classics.
Really?
That's what I wanted to read. After O-level, I had roughly similar marks in Latin, Greek, history, English. That's probably it. Yeah. And so it was an interesting question, as you remember, in those days, and indeed still is in a way, what you go on to do at A-level after, well, now GCSE, but in those days O-level. And I think I made the wrong choice, to be frank. I mean, I think I should have read either English or history, probably history. It's interesting that both my sons have done history.
Really?
And
so your son did history at King's?
Yeah.
I should have met him. That's odd. But anyway, yes.
I went into the sixth classical, I suppose, because, again, in the kind of school that mine was, and I suspect yours might have been, the kudos on the arts side was to do Latin, Greek, and ancient history. The kudos on the science side was to do maths, further maths, and physics. So that if you did physics, chemistry, and biology, you were regarded as a slightly inferior kind of scientist, and so on. And I think some of that still sticks, actually. I think mathematicians around the place and the physicists really regard pure maths as being the highest form of life. Anything else is a sad descent from it. So I did Latin, Greek, and ancient history, and I was extremely well taught by a very contrasting pair of teachers, one of whom had a double first from Cambridge, notorious for getting the sixth form to do the wrong set books, but who taught me about scholarship in a curious way, because he was a very scholarly man. And I can remember there was some crux in the text. We were doing Aeschylus Agamemnon, I remember, and he said, I don't agree with the notes. This is an Oxford classical text, for heaven's sake. How can you disagree with that? And he said, I'll write you a note about it. And he gave to the classical sixth, which included Nigel MacCulloch, he gave us 3 pages of notes on this thing that had gone wrong with the text, whereas all you needed for A-level, even in those days, was only about a couple of lines. But it was that kind of reproduction. You remember those purple banda things, that reproduction things. So he encouraged me in classics, and so too did my other teacher who taught ancient history, who had been at Corpus and had been vivaed for a first in Greats and hadn't got one. And I think thought that I would relive his dream but get the first that he didn't. Unfortunately, I failed him at the very first hurdle because I just was completely floored by the entrance interview by W.F.R. Hardy, then the president of Corpus, who I remember interviewed me and asked the most simple questions, really, about English words derivation from Latin and Greek. I was utterly tongue-tied. And then I had a second interview on my classical general paper, I remember, and I still remember it now. I'd done a question on, would you rather have been a Greek or a Roman? And I said I'd rather have been a Roman, because if I'd picked the time correctly, it could have been quite peaceful, there would have been a reasonable police force, I could have lived in a centrally heated villa, and as an educated Roman, I would have had access to all Greek literature anyway, so I get the best of both worlds. And then, overplaying my hand as clever 17-year-olds do, I ended with what I thought was a good ending by saying, finally, I said, I think the Greeks are probably rather tiresome. And I was interviewed about this, and what was my evidence for saying the Greeks were tiresome? Now I would say, what do you mean evidence? They either are tiresome or they're not. Anyway, so I didn't get into read classics, and so I had to rethink my tactics, and I could do general papers, and they just introduced a new entrance exam for PPE, which included 3 general papers, 1 précis, 1 general essay, and 1 of those kind of puzzle papers, you know, Fred Smith and George Jones are engine drivers, and they set out from Edinburgh Waverley and London Euston, and what was the name of the signal box person at Grantham, that kind of stuff. Because I got the wrong track, but anyway. And I could do those. I still can do them, not as quickly as I could in those days. And I had to do 2 other papers, I remember. One was a Latin Unseen, which was reasonably easy, and the other was a paper on politics. And I did 1 term of kind of intensive coaching from the master who taught politics. I was interested in politics, but not in the sense that you were asking me earlier. I mean, I always read the newspapers and was up to date on current affairs, as you might say. And I got in and was offered an exhibition. The report going back to my school from Worcester College insulted them greatly. And they said they thought he was very promising but was gravely undertaught. But the other thing was that straight away they wrote to me saying, wouldn't you like to read classics? We don't think you could do honour mods, but we think you could do greats. And there's a new thing called classical prelim, which you can do. But by that stage, I'd decided that classics wasn't for me, and so I declined politely. But as a result, I'd always assumed that it would be philosophy that I would be good at, and in the prelims year, that's absolutely true. I was good at philosophy and reasonably good at politics. And I scraped through prelims on economics, only because I think I got a gamma plus or something, and it was compensated for by an alpha minus on philosophy. And it really wasn't until sometime during my second year doing economics that it all suddenly clicked. And I have no idea to this day why. And I've always regarded myself as an accidental economist. I'm not really an economist at all. Dick Sargent, the tutor here, suggested I went in for the George Webb Medley Economics Prize, which was the thing that then was offered at the end of the second year for economics. And you had to do a general paper and an applied economics paper and an economic theory paper. And to my intense astonishment, and this is not false modesty, I won it. So there I was, allegedly anyway, the best economist of my generation. Sorry?
The university prize.
Yeah. Beating various people who've become much better known as economists and are much better economists. And then I was virtually programmed, as it were, to go to Nuffield and onwards. But I hadn't intended to do that at all. in my first long vacation, I did an Understanding British Industry course through the Careers Service with the Dunlop Rubber Company, which had 2 plants on Merseyside, one in Walton, which made moulded rubber footwear, and the other one in Speke, which turned out tyres. And I really enjoyed it. So at the beginning of my second year, I wrote to them saying, can I know that the course isn't available to me, but is there anything I could do? And they very kindly fixed me up another set of, I suppose you'd now call it, internships, at the end of which they offered me a job. So I was expecting to go into Dunlop to train as a cost and works accountant and go into industry like my father. I mean, it never occurred to me to be an academic. And when I'd won this Webb Medley Prize, I said to my father, now what do I do? And he said, well, I should write to Dunlop and say you've won the university prize and they'll offer you more money. So I wrote saying I've won the university prize in economics. And they wrote back a letter which I really should have preserved, because it said, this is British industry's view of itself in 1962, congratulations on winning the university prize in economics. We assume you will therefore no longer wish to join us. And that wasn't my intention at all, so I didn't.
We were here together for 3 years as undergraduates. I mean, one could have a whole interview about that, but can you pick out something about the atmosphere of Worcester this is 1960 to 63, or any particular events that you remember as important to you subsequently or at the time? I mean, in other words, just say anything you like about those 3 years, because there's so much to say, really.
Well, I mean, I made good friends. I suppose my closest friends were people like John Monks and Peter Gooden and Mark Cullingham.
These are all people who are reading English.
Yes, for some. Well, John was reading English, and therefore the others were, and Alistair and yourself. I suppose the thing that brings back those years is actually a piece of music, because in the very first summer, I remember, Mark Cullingham had, I think it was a college rented house in Wellington Square, and Mark was a very, very keen enthusiast for a piece of music I had never heard before and always associated with that summer, which is Prokofiev's Classical Symphony. And funnily enough, I was just driving yesterday to go and get a prescription for my wife, and it came on Classic FM, and straight away I was back in that summer of 1961, the first summer we were here. That I remember. The other thing I remember is sitting in the lower library after I'd won the Webb Medley Prize and was thinking I had a golden future ahead of me, and the Cuban Missile Crisis appeared, and I can remember looking out over this very quadrangle thinking, crikey, this is all going to be vaporized fairly soon, and that was quite a scary bit.
This is spring 1963.
Yeah, well, whatever, yes.
And that was the cold winter. It was the two things.
And that very cold winter, yes, that's true. I mean, it's really episodic, my memory. Sounds, smells, but of course, since I've been here continuously since, there's a sense in which any memory I have may well be overlain with things that have happened subsequently, so that I wouldn't rely on it as a memory of myself as an undergraduate, because in a sense I've never quite distanced myself in the way that the rest of you have from where I've been an undergraduate. But I think acting, or at least not acting in my case, well, acting in the very first term in a thing called the Apollo of Bellac, which was directed by Henry Weiss, who was a senior status guy who lived in our house, because we lived in 20 Worcester Place with Mark Davis and John Monks and Henry and me.
This is just down, turn left, and you had a room on the left.
Absolutely.
I spent a lot of time
That's
there.
right. No. Again, I remember it as a kind of happy time. I've had a boringly happy life, I'm afraid, in many ways. I mean, there have been black periods in it, but broadly speaking, it's been...
We always had there were several things I remember about you. One was that you had a cheerful and sunny disposition.
Yes.
And the other was the great art of effortless superiority, in the sense that you never seemed to do any work. And yet you won these prizes and got firsts, and we all sweated away and got seconds.
Yeah, I don't know about that. One person I can remember is Paul Hyams.
Yes.
And I remember him irritating the hell out of me, and I suspect contributed to quite a number of us doing better than we otherwise would have done by wandering round and criticising. He would come into your room while you were writing an essay and pick up, one of the pieces of paper you'd let fall on the floor, and start to read it and say, "No, that's not right," or whatever, in a very Hyams-ish way. So he was an influence.
He was a pace setter.
Yes, he was.
Many. James Campbell decided I was faltering and might achieve something, so he put me with Paul for about a year, side by side. And of course, you can imagine Paul's essays and Paul's kindly elderly brother comments on my essays and what I was doing wrong, which I think must have helped enormously.
Yes, I think that's one of the things we didn't have at Worcester in those days, and we do have in Worcester now, which is a sense that quite a lot of people are going to get firsts, and that becomes cumulative. Now, admittedly, the number of firsts overall has gone up considerably, but now something over a third of the college gets firsts, and there is a palpable intellectual atmosphere in the college, which I, of course, welcome. But I don't think there was in those days. I remember the year, funnily enough, my memory of being an undergraduate is more concentrated on the people in the year ahead of us, people who were very rich and pretty stupid. No, I won't say who they were, but I remember, you remember we had collections in the upper senior common room, and you used to stand on the stairs waiting for collections, and they were always late, I remember. And this particular group of rather well-heeled young men were kind of ahead of us on the stairs, and they used to be chattering away about, I wonder what the poor old fool will say about my work this term. And then after they'd gone in and had their collection, they'd come out rather quiet and and go back down the stairs again, and then resume whatever hijinks they were up to in Pump Quad, because they all had rather grand rooms in Pump Quad.
What was the difference between those years then? Were they they'd done national service?
A lot of them had, of course, hadn't they? There was a big gap between ourselves and the second year, because most of the second year had done national service, and very few of us had. I think Chris Power had. There were one or two others I remember, but that must have been as big a gap as for a long time between one generation and another. So they seemed considerably older.
One of the things I remember most was that suddenly there was a sense of liberation, because at a northern boarding school, for instance, we weren't allowed to know of the existence of girls. So coming to Oxford was the first real experience of girlfriends. We couldn't entertain really, and I went out and bought cups at Woolworths with spotted black and white cups and entertained in my room, and could give people sherry. And so suddenly you were a young gentleman, and people called you sir. And, you seemed to take a huge step up a ladder into a free, open world, which out of a closed kind of world of a boarding school. Did you
Yes.
sense this?
Yes, because the atmosphere in my school was very much of a boarding school. I mean, I rarely got home much before 6 o'clock at night, and then I'd have a couple of hours homework to do. So home was where you slept. We had school on Saturdays, all Saturday. So and when I became a senior boy, there was morning service on a Sunday as well. So I might as well have been at a boarding school.
Although the torture of the dormitories was
Exactly, the torture of the dormitories was missing. That's perfectly true. And it is true, yes, it was liberating. I mean, being at a day school, I had encountered girls, knew what they were, and so on. But I agree with you, it was very liberating. And it's one of the things that's very different about undergraduates now, which is that they have free and easy relationships already before they come up. And I think this is rather charming in a way. They don't want to distance themselves from their parents in the same way that you and I did. I mean, you came up, you sent a trunk on in advance, and you were here for 8 weeks.
It was embarrassing if your parents came.
Very embarrassing if your parents came up. Your parents were immensely embarrassing. Whereas I meet parents, of course, because we have these parents' guest nights every term, and the parents become very integrated into the college, and I observe how often they know their friends, their children's friends, for example, quite well. Obviously, there's a lot of staying with people and so on, and I think that's really very pleasant. But of course, the parents now have themselves been to university, quite a lot of them, not necessarily to Oxford or Cambridge, but they've been to university and they have some notion of what it is they have to do, and if there's a danger, it's sometimes that they try and interfere too much, not that they're remote like my parents certainly were, not that they were not loving and so on, but they were just 200 miles away and you didn't go.
And as you say, many of them hadn't been to university, so when they came, they were embarrassing because they didn't know how to talk or behave.
Yeah, not so much that, but as I said, my father was just, on the whole, supremely indifferent to universities. He once said to me after I'd become a don, "What do you do all day, you people?" He said, "You just stand around and talk." So I have never grown up with a great sort of respect in that sense, awe of universities at all.
When you started by saying the friendships, I mean, I think that's probably the thing that most...
there are two things that people remember about Worcester, and I'm no exception, are the people you were with, the friends, and some people like Alistair and so on, Ewan Porter, John Monks, obviously, you, and so on. The other is the sheer beauty of the place, and that is something that Worcester people remember in a way that I doubt whether people at Exeter or Jesus or Lincoln, well, possibly Lincoln, because that jewel of a little quad, but otherwise not. And that's one of the things I shall miss when I leave this house, is the setting sun catching the stone, and it is absolutely beautiful. So it is a lovely place to be.
And somehow, because Oxford, certainly for me, from the Dragon onwards, was associated with a kind of fairyland, because I was in love with romantic poetry and children's stories and Alice and so on. And the fact that the little tunnel way, I was told, had been the one that inspired Lewis Carroll to the entry to Wonderland and so on. The whole thing sort of, you seem to be on the edge of another mysterious and more beautiful kind of gypsy scholar kind of world, which few of the colleges have that. They're much more.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I can remember, do you remember they did, again, Mark Cullingham producing it, they did Ring Round the Moon.
I do.
And I think they used that big plane tree in the garden, didn't they, and lit the bark. And I never pass it without thinking of that. So
and one or two of the Shakespeare they did
Yes.
out on the lake.
absolutely. Well, that was always Coghill, wasn't it? That was his trademark.
So there was a sort of magic.
Oh yes, and there still is the famous production that Coghill did, which he did in 47, 48, before our time, which more people claim to have seen than can possibly ever have done it, which is the famous production of The Tempest, in which Ariel, and the final scene, runs across the lake on a platform underneath the water, and then up into the trees on the far side of the lake. Some years ago, the cast reassembled under the tutelage of Godfrey Smith, who used to be the editor of the Sunday Times colour comic, who's an old member. And Ariel was still alive and stood at the edge of the lake and recited his final speech, and there was not a dry eye in the house. There really wasn't. And I was there as a guest, and my eyes weren't dry, and I never saw it.
Yes, we heard all these stories. And one of the abiding memories, we'd have lunch or breakfast, and then we'd sort of pair up, and then we would go walking round and round the grounds, discussing life
and things. And do you remember War on Want lunches
Yes,
too?
yes.
That Alistair and I used to go and buy huge quantities of cheese from and the college allowed you to opt out of your meal plan and credited the War on Want with you remember?
And Oxfam was starting then.
That's
I used to
right.
go and work in the first Oxfam office.
Sure.
So it was anyway. This is interesting for us, but perhaps not. We better not go on too much about it. You then went on to Nuffield to do a PhD, or DPhil.
Yes, that was the idea, that I would do a DPhil. I went to Nuffield on a Milk Marketing Board scholarship in agricultural economics. By this stage, I had met my first wife, and she was already well on the way to completing her course as a social worker. And in a rather old-fashioned, perhaps it wasn't old-fashioned in those days, view, I thought I ought to contribute to the family budget. So I looked around for a lucrative postgraduate award, and the most lucrative awards were both in agricultural economics, one from the Pig Industry Development Authority, I remember, and the other from the Milk Marketing Board. And I got the Milk Marketing Board one, and they wanted to send me to Manchester University, which had a very good reputation for agricultural economics. But by that stage, I also got into Nuffield, and the warden of Nuffield, I think, intervened on my behalf, and the Milk Marketing Board scholarship was transferred to here. And I went to see a man called Terence Gorman, who was the professor of mathematical economics, and he gave me a very, very bad piece of advice. I said, look, I'm a classicist by training, originally at school. I happen to have been good at economics, but I know it's a fluke. If I'm going to be an economist, I absolutely have got to do mathematical economics. I must learn that. And Terence, who's a supreme and sublime mathematician, but a lovely, genial Irishman, said, why would you want to do that? I won't try and put his accent on, but why would you want to do that? If you learn mathematics for 2 years, all you'll ever be is a third-rate mathematical economist. Why not be a first-rate non-mathematical economist? And that was a very bad piece of advice. I should have done what I'd intended to do and really learnt the grammar of mathematical economics. I taught economics pretty well for 10 years, I think, but by the end of that, as it were, my cover had been blown. I don't think I would have been fit to teach undergraduates much more. No, because the subject was moving on and in ways that I could not really follow.
That's interesting. What was the thesis on?
Oh, well, I had to do something which would suit the Milk Marketing Board. So I did my thesis on the use of American food surpluses under their Public Law 480, PL 480 food surplus, as aid to developing countries. And I was comparing the direct aid from America bilaterally to countries through PL 480 with a more roundabout route where they gave PL 480 supplies to the newly established World Food Programme, which is part of the UN FAO, and then the FAO then distributed the food. And I looked at projects in Turkey, which was extremely interesting, and I also looked at what was going on in Rome and in the FAO headquarters. 2 or 3 times Alistair and I drove down to Italy, he to go to the British School and me to work in FAO. But then I got a fellowship at St Edmund Hall. These were extraordinary days because all a generation of people teaching at London, Oxford and Cambridge went off to be the new professors in the new universities, Sussex, Essex, Warwick, Kent, whatever. Dick Sargent, who has been my tutor here, went to be the first professor of economics at Warwick. John Vasey, who succeeded him here, went off fairly quickly to be professor of economics at Brunel. My graduate supervisor, who was a fellow of St Edmund Hall, was unsettled by all this, but he moved in a different way. He became the chief economist of a big American multinational food industry company called W.R. Grace. And so he left, and I more or less stepped into his shoes as fellow and tutor in economics at St Edmund Hall. But the days were very, very different in those days, because I remember being interviewed for a post in economic history, which in retrospect would have been a good post to take, but at St Peter's, a fellowship in economic history. And the chairman of the selection committee was none other than Professor Sir John Hicks, Oxford's only genuine Nobel Prize winner in economics. I said to John Hicks, I don't know any economic history. And he said, oh, you could get it up. So it was a very different world, I think, in those days. And then after a couple of years at Teddy Hall, then when John Vasey left here and went back to Brunel, I was asked to come back here, and I had a curious non-interview interview. I was already a fellow of another college, so they couldn't interview me, and I knew I was meeting the interview panel, and the interview panel knew that I knew that I was being interviewed by the interviewed panel, but neither side could kind of quite say this, so we discussed how in principle one might teach economics.
Were there other people interviewed?
Yes. As always in Oxford, you discover who it was later. Some of them much more distinguished than me, and most of them, I'm pleased to say, got other jobs at inferior colleges, like much richer ones. But the effect on my PhD was that my then university supervisor, a lovely man called Arthur Hazelwood, who was a fellow of Pembroke, but a very non-interventionist supervisor, said to me, now you're going to stop doing your DPhil, aren't you? And I said, why would I do that? And he said, 2 reasons. One is you'll be teaching so much you won't possibly have time to finish it. And secondly, he said, in any case, it would be indecent if you got one. And this is about 1966, 7. And not a single member of the economics faculty in Oxford had a doctorate. Nobody.
In fact, it would rather lower your status than...
Well, I don't know quite that. I mean, it had moved on from that. There certainly had been a time when it would have been a mark of somebody coming from an inferior university that they needed to be called a doctor. But that was another mistake, a very bad mistake, not to do it. I got a long way in it, and at the suggestion of my non-interventionist supervisor, I did write a long, boring article about my thesis. Now, that was actually also a mistake, because once, in a sense, the theme of your thesis is out in the public domain, there's not much point in finishing the thesis, because you've made your contribution to scholarship or whatever it is, and mine wasn't very significant. It's been cited a couple of times, but that's about it. But I had 26 files of material in my attic, and I had a letter from a graduate student at St Andrews who said he understood I had a lot of unpublished material about the early years of the World Food Programme, and I said yes. Could he come and read it? Of course. And I liked him a lot, and I said to him, why don't you just take it? So I gave it to him.
And he used it?
Yes, he did. He got he actually transferred from St Andrews to Cambridge and got a Cambridge doctorate. Wrote a book about it afterwards. It has a nice thank you to me in the beginning. But I felt so relieved this albatross had gone from round my neck. I didn't have the doctorate hanging over me, accusingly sitting in files.
Was it the waste aspect, or was it that it would have been useful to be doctored?
Oh, I think it would have been useful to be doctor because, I've just been completely overtaken by events. I mean, nobody can teach in university in Britain now without the meal ticket, in a way.
But your colleagues, I mean, the James Campbells and the Harry Pitts and the...
But they're that much older, Alan. I remember you always were set on doing a doctorate, and you were right.
I did too.
Yeah, I know. You were absolutely right.
Laying up treasures upon earth.
Well, it's also it's an investment. I mean, in there's a sense in which every job I've had, I have felt, crikey, that was lucky.
If only they knew.
Yeah, exactly.
So, did you come back to Worcester because of sentimental reasons, or was it a better job? Or
not really.
Teddy Hall
was very nice. I was just flattered to be asked, probably.
Did you know G.D. Ramsay at all?
Yes, absolutely.
He taught me at Teddy Hall.
Yeah, he's a lovely guy, and a Worcester man.
Was he?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I mean, he taught me the wool industry in Wiltshire.
That's great.
Then didn't you? Perhaps it was from here that you were involved with the Treasury.
Yeah, that was after a couple of years, and I went on secondment, part-time secondment to the Treasury for what in the end turned out to be about 3 years. It happened. Everything in my life, Alan, happens entirely by accident. This was the result of an ill-judged question at a seminar. There was and still is a thing in Oxford called the Oxford University Business Summer School. It's called something different now. It's called the University Summer Economics Programme. It's aimed at bright young businessmen who've not done economics. It's an intensive course of economics, in those days lasting a month. And the pattern in those days anyway was that you had plenary lectures. There are about 45 candidates or something like that. You have plenary lectures and you divide into syndicates of about 10 or 12. That happens in the morning, and in the afternoon people do their own homework and so on, and in 5 o'clock there's another lecture, and then after dinner somebody from the real world talks about whatever you've been dealing with in the day. And one of the tutors is in charge of the evening session. It's a very, very intensive and very hard work, but it's extremely well paid, or was. And I was on duty when Sir Donald McDougall, the government chief economic advisor, gave an after-dinner talk. And Donald had a very quiet voice anyway, and he was a pretty unimpressive speaker. And we all used to sit around on sort of armchairs. This was in Merton, as I recall it, not on sort of ergonomically designed lecture theatre chairs as one would be in now. And pretty well the whole audience was snoozing. And Donald got to the end of what he had to say, and I clearly had to ask a question, because there clearly wasn't going to be one from the floor. And I said, Sir Donald, would you care to look over the edge of the abyss and tell us how deep it is? And this is 1968. And he looked at me for a long minute, and then he said, I have never believed the view common amongst economists that a country cannot go bankrupt. Now, he did not know, but that very morning I'd been lecturing on international economics, and I had said, it is ludicrous to think that countries can go bankrupt. And of course, these are bright young men. I mean, admittedly, well, there were some women, but mostly men. And they were snoozing, but they weren't snoozing that much. So they woke up and then plied him with the most torrid set of questions for about half an hour till I could bring it to an end about what he meant. And so I found myself, this is a bit of local colour, in the next stall to Donald after the lecture, peeing with him. And I said, I'm terribly sorry to have asked you that question. I thought I was giving you a half volley on the leg stump. And he said, you'd better come and find out how difficult it is. And I said, oh, that'd be very interesting. And he said, do you mean that? And I said, yeah. And a month later, I was in the Treasury.
A lovely story. And what did you find?
Well, I found I was put in a thing called FH2, which stood for Home Finance, or more accurately, Finance Home, second group. We reported to a really bright young thing called Robert Armstrong. And we did monetary policy. I was there put in at Donald's request in order to shadow a really bright young Treasury official called Andrew Edwards, who was strongly suspected of being at least a covert, if not a real monetarist. And this is the days, the height of the monetarist Keynesian debate. And I have always been a very strong believer in the views of that great fellow of kings. So I was put in really to shadow Andrew Edwards. Now, he was much too clever a civil servant not to know that, and equally much too clever a civil servant not to circumvent me perfectly easily. But nevertheless, I did monetary policy, and I found myself part of a group which redesigned the control of the UK banking system, which was one of the specialisms I lectured on in the university. We devised between us the thing known as competition and credit control, which was promulgated in 1971, I think. And it was an interesting time, really interesting. The IMF was around. And of course, the great delight, apart from Donald McDougall, who was wonderful, had this wonderful way of guessing at forecasts and so on, and would draw on his pipe and use a kind of petrol lighter, which he managed nearly always practically to burn the Treasury down each time he lit his pipe. But the other great delight, the person I worked with more than anybody else, was Michael Posner.
Oh, right.
And he was just wonderful.
Was he at Cambridge then?
Yes, he was. Yeah. But he was a very Oxford man at Cambridge, I have to say. I think he was regarded with some suspicion by the more cerebral Cambridge economists as not quite up to the mark. And of course, at Cambridge at the time, and has been ever since, was one of my Nuffield contemporaries, namely Bob Rowthorne.
Oh, right. I've interviewed him.
Right. Well, I don't know what he thinks about Nuffield, but he was what I should have turned myself into, namely a mathematical economist.
Well, that's 3 years, so we better move back. You stopped doing that after 3 years. How big a gap was there between that and becoming provost? When did you become provost?
Oh, not till 1991. It's a long gap. We're talking about
I'll fit in a little bit of
20 years. Okay, well, I came back to Oxford and taught. Fairly soon after that, I was asked out of the blue to go and have lunch in London with a company which was facing arraignment before the Monopolies and Mergers Commission. And I said, this is not me, I'm not a microeconomist. And they said, we understand that you're a very good teacher, and that's exactly what we need, because we have to convince the Monopolies Commission, and these people are not technical economists. So I said, okay, well, tell me a bit about it. And I went to lunch, and the company turned out to be the Pedigree Pet Foods division of Mars, Mars being the international confectionery and food industry company. And I remember saying to them, well, before I agree to do anything, let's just get clear what you're going to define as success. And they said, 100% clean bill of health. And I said, what? You have, I can't remember now the figures, but it was something of the order of 37% of the market and return on capital employed of 52% or something really ridiculous. And I said, there's no way we're going to get a clean bill of health with those figures. But 2.5 years later, we did. And that was very stimulating. I was working with Jeremy Lever, who was the QC, fellow of All Souls, very bright, having done the MPhil in economics some years before, I think. And a man called John Swift, who was his junior, who also became a very leading QC and so on. They were a very good team. And as I say, the result of all that was that, somewhat amazingly, we got away with a clean bill of health. And the Monopolies Commission works a bit like a law court. There's a certain sort of adversarial system in it. And once the case was over, I let it be known to various friends from the Treasury that I thought we had been allowed to get away with various arguments we really should not have been allowed to get away with. And I was summoned to see the minister, and I assumed it was to talk about the deficiencies of the Government Economic Service, and to my astonishment he said, what would you bring to the Monopolies Commission? And I said, how do you mean? He said, well, as a member. And I said, well, right at this minute, Minister, a strong sense of the absurd. He said, you're hired. So I found myself on the Monopolies Commission, and that was a part-time job, and I did various cases, including on my 40th birthday writing a memorandum of dissent on a Monopolies Commission case involving banks, interestingly enough, where I argued that the Hong Kong and Shanghai bank should be allowed to take over, or should be allowed to bid for a British bank in order to introduce more competition. Shades of the present day. And gradually I got more and more senior in the commission, and again, as a result of an accident, the chief administrator of the Monopolies Commission is called the secretary. I don't know whether it still is, but it was called the secretary, which always caused companies we went to visit a great deal of difficulty, because if they had to put us up in a hotel or somewhere, they usually thought the secretary was somebody very junior. So the secretary was a very senior civil servant. Often had to change rooms with the most junior civil servant. And I said to the secretary after one hearing, which had been extremely badly handled by one of the deputy chairmen who was chairing the particular inquiry, who had really let a company off the hook, having got them into a really point where they could have been made to say some interesting things and let them off. I said, God, I was so cross. I said, if I couldn't do it better than that, I'd be shot. And the secretary said, what did you say? And I said it again, slightly less exasperatedly. And he said, you do know that there's going to be a vacancy in a month for a deputy chairman? And I said, no, I had no idea. And he said, if you're willing to have your name put forward, we'll put it forward. And so I became deputy chairman, which I did for 3 years. But at the same time, I was running the Department for Continuing Education. I'd stopped being a tutorial fellow here, as I said to you, partly because I really felt that I was getting to the point where I wasn't really capable of teaching really bright undergraduates. So I stopped teaching in 76 and took on the role of director of the Department for External Studies, as it was called in those days, the university's continuing education department. I'd always done a lot of lecturing for adult groups for the Workers' Educational Association and so on. I really, really enjoyed teaching adults. So I opted for that job in 76 and got it. So I was running a university department, which is largely an administrative job, though in order to stop my colleagues saying that you have no idea what it's like to drive out on a damp night in November, I used to do that and used to enjoy doing that. I was still in the university, and having been chairman of the Social Studies Faculty Board, well, chairman of economics at one point, and then chairman of the Social Studies Faculty Board, and so on, I was on a thing called the General Board of Faculties. The monopolist job was 3 years. I had 3 years leave of absence as director of my department. In the last year of that, I was told that the chairman wanted to apply for me to stay on for a longer period. But I didn't hear anything, and I didn't hear anything, and I didn't hear anything. Meanwhile, the General Board was busy electing its next chairman, and they asked me to do the job, and I said I would, assuming that I wouldn't be asked to go on the Monopolies Commission. And 2 days later, a letter which had been misdirected, shows what government computers are like. It had actually been sent to my address from when I'd been a young man in the Treasury, caught up with me, and it said, will you stay on the Monopolies Commission as Deputy Chairman for another 3 years? But by that stage I'd said to the university that I'd come back as Chairman of the General Board, so that's what I did. And I wrote to Angus Maud, I can't remember, Maud, saying I'm very sorry, I've agreed to go back to the university and I can't go back on that. So I became chairman of the General Board for 2 years, and while I was doing that job, I was asked whether I would allow my name to go forward as provost, and I said yeah. So
that's how it happened.
That's how it happened. I've only recently discovered who my two rivals were.
Are you allowed to say? Or?
I don't think I should, but I do. One of them subsequently became a head of another college, and is, alas, now dead. Was an excellent head of that college, and would have been an excellent head of this one.
I think last night it was mentioned something about the vice chancellorship. You were a contender for that.
Well, you aren't a contender as such. This is a long time ago. This is when Colin Lucas became Vice Chancellor. John Hood's difficult regime was about the last 5 years. Colin Lucas, I think, did 7, didn't he? So we must be talking about, oh, goodness me, 1990 something. 6, 7, 8. Yes, I didn't get the job. I mean, if I'm absolutely frank, I would not have got me to that far.
Sounds like Groucho Marx.
Yeah, exactly. I was disappointed in the way that one is, but I wasn't in the sort of David Miliband stage of disappointment. And in many ways it's turned out very much for the better, because I've hugely enjoyed the job here, and I'm not sure I would have enjoyed being, probably.
Would you have had to give up, or you wouldn't have been provost if you'd done that?
Well, in those days, the Vice Chancellor did retain whatever substantive job he had, so that Colin Lucas remained Master of Balliol. But you it's very difficult, or was in those days in the regime, for the college, because they have to appoint somebody in your stead. And the advantage is that the Vice-Chancellor gets to use his official residence associated with his college job, whereas when the possibility was being contemplated of having a so-called professional Vice-Chancellor, the university bought a house for the Vice-Chancellor up the Banbury Road, which is nice, but not a patch on this, for example, or the Master's lodgings at Jesus or whatever.
I mean, just on the Vice-Chancellorship, you were. We've talked about the difficult years of Hood. You taught.
I did. Yes, he was my graduate student, and what's more, I was on the committee that appointed him.
Yes, and visited him in Australia before.
This is him in New Zealand.
Oh, New Zealand.
Yes.
I mean, why was it difficult? He tried to change the university very considerably, didn't he? In a short time. Was that the difficulty?
No. I think he misread the situation when he came in. The university's finances were extremely foggy. We had done exactly the same thing that our distinguished sister university had done, which is to introduce a new accounting system based on Oracle. And when we went into this, we said, we'll avoid all those mistakes that Cambridge made. And lo and behold, we did not. And at the time, the management of the university's finance division was not up to the task. John interpreted this, I think, as evidence of a deep structural weakness in the way the university worked, and sought to impose a different model, essentially a North American state university model, where there would be a kind of board of regents and so on. Well, let's leave that aside for a minute. What was actually flawed was his reading of the situation, because one of the good things he did, and it could be said about John that he was absolutely first-rate chief financial officer, perhaps not quite the temperament and personality to be a good chief executive officer or chairman. But he appointed a very good director of finance, and lo and behold, the fog lifted. The university had a miraculous turnaround one year from the other, suggesting, as it were, that the situation had never been as bad in the first place. But John persisted with his deep structural reforms and was defeated by congregation.
And quite a lot of the opposition was from this college.
Yeah, that was interesting. And I didn't believe it at first. As it happened, I had a pulmonary embolism and then pneumonia in the spring of that year when John was introducing his reforms. And there's a sense in which I was just missing for, I don't know, 12 weeks, something like that. And when I got out of hospital, almost the first phone call I had was from the head of another college, who said, "You must call your dogs off, Dick." And I said, "What dogs are those?" And this person said, "The people who are persecuting John Hood and making his life a misery." And I said, no, you've got it, that can't be right. They're not fellows of this college. Worcester is the most politically apathetic college. The fellows are busy doing their own things. You must have mistaken us. But I was wrong. there were at least 2 fellows of the college who were very, very strongly in the inner group which opposed John. But I certainly was not going to, well, A, it wouldn't have done any good anyway. You can't call your dogs off. They're not my dogs. But quite apart from anything else, I thought, although I thought sometimes their tactics were not wonderful, I thought they were right. That John was trying to reform the university in a way which cut across the grain of the university. And the notion that the university is full of silly old fuddy-duddies who were all right-wing and so on is just absurd. I mean, the whole political centre of your university and this university will be to the left of centre by quite a long way. So it's not that they're not capable of radical thinking. It just is that they were not convinced that this model with kind of a board of trustees and then various things under it was what was required. And I think they were right. Whereas Alison Richard, John's counterpart in a sense in Cambridge, I think went about things much more quietly.
Very tactfully.
And really rather well.
Yes, she's wonderful.
So, damn it, you got the right, we didn't.
I mean, was part of it, one of the differences between Oxford and Cambridge, as I've observed it, is the relationship between the university and the colleges. That is to say, the colleges here seem to be much more powerful and autonomous.
Well, now that's funny, because as we look at Cambridge, it always looks exactly the other way around. That is, it looks as if we're weak and you're strong. You're certainly richer on the whole than Oxford colleges are. Certainly Trinity is far richer than St John's, which is the richest of the lot. I don't know. I mean, it is true, of course, there is the joint appointment system in Oxford, which there isn't in Cambridge. And what I didn't do when we were talking about the background to my being a candidate as Vice-Chancellor is that I'd been on the North Committee, which proposed reforms to the way Oxford worked. I voted in the end for the continuation of the joint appointment system. If I was now on a committee, I would not. I think that there are advantages and disadvantages in both systems, and I think myself now that the balance has shifted in favour of the Cambridge system rather than the Oxford system. No, I don't think it had anything to do with joint appointments. It had to do with essentially whether you think that academics are capable of governing themselves, and I think they are. And what's more, I think it's better if they do. And I worry about the increasing incidence of, quotes, professional managers, even in universities. And that's probably because, although I've been a strong supporter of management studies in Oxford and have taught quite a lot for the predecessors of the Said Business School, the Oxford Centre for Management Studies and Templeton College, I really do not believe there is much scientific about management science, and I basically don't believe that there are a set of kind of transferable skills which can be moved from the health service one week to running something else another week, and then to running a major company, and then running a university. I think this is rubbish. I think you have to understand properly, down to quite a fine level of detail, what it is you're trying to manage. And I think that's often better done by people who know where the bodies are, essentially.
Well, that very conveniently takes us into the last 10 minutes, and the last thing I wanted to talk about. What is it that you're trying to manage as Provost of Worcester College for 20 years? What is the...
I don't think I'm trying to manage anything, Alan. What am I trying to
do?
Facilitate, I think. I think this is the Smethurst theory of academic management, if you like. I don't think that you are managing in the sense that you would be managing a company, anything. I have sometimes said it to John Hood, who wasn't very pleased about it, that you are actually managing a shopping mall. It is where it is. It's not going to move anywhere else. It's here. Your job is to keep the street swept, the shops attractive, and to have good people passing through. Sometimes the shops will chain hands, and that's very good. And that's what you've got to do. You've got to facilitate, enable. You're not a director in kind of film world, you're a producer. You bring together the resources and let other people flourish. That's my theory of what you're supposed to do. And I think you have to recognize that in a university like yours or this one, however good a degree you have, there is a group of people who are just way beyond it. And what you have to do is not to be threatened by that, but just to say, wow, and take pleasure in it.
When you say way beyond it, you mean people much cleverer than yourself?
Yeah, much cleverer. And you just delight in it because you are enough of an academic to see what their skills are. And really to enjoy it. So that's true for the fellows. Whether I've succeeded, I don't know, but that's what I would like to say. For the kids, it's rather the same. I mean, they are very talented. They are multi-talented, as I was trying to say last night. I think they are better rounded people than we were, more skills. The degree to which they've followed anything to any depth is much less than was true in our day. But I think the job of an Oxford or Cambridge college is to allow people to develop their own all-round talents to the highest degree. Now, that's not very easy to put down in terms of targets and achievements and whatever, but it's extremely important, it seems to me. And it gives me pleasure when good people get firsts. It equally gives me pleasure when people act well or play music well or play sport well or whatever. One of my children went to another college and told me that the address that's given by the head of house to freshers says you are here to work, 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 and work. And what I say to freshers is, if all you ever do while you're here in Oxford is work, you are wasting your time. If you never go into the Ashmolean, if you never go into the Playhouse, if you never go to a concert in the Sheldonian, you have wasted your time. Now, it's a different attitude to what it is we're trying to do. And I think we are trying to allow people room to grow under challenging circumstances. I think it's important we challenge them. It's extremely important. It wasn't true when we were undergraduates that they are challenged academically. We are much fiercer on their academic progress than we were. We take collections, both in terms of end-of-term reports and in terms of college examinations, much more seriously. They're invigilated, they're marked, and so on. It is much more competitive to get into the college than it was, and indeed one of the things I'm most proud about is that, partly as a consequence of this big building program I've led over the last 7 or 8 years, for the last 5 or 6 years we have had more applicants than any other college by quite a long way, and that gives us more choice, so we can choose really good people and make it a place where they then develop their talents. And when I contrast this with my younger stepdaughter who went to Sussex, now she was absolutely determined she wasn't going to Oxford or Cambridge. Her mother, her stepfather, her natural father, her uncle, everybody had been to Oxford or Cambridge. Absolutely not. Happy to go to Sussex, had the right course and so on. It didn't actually turn out to be the right course, but that's a different question. She's very tall, very athletic, very concerned with, not with sport, but with being fit. This sounds like a terribly old-fashioned view, but at Fresher's week in any Oxbridge college, she would be put into a boat. She's tall, very long levers. She would have loved it. Equally, she has grade 8 clarinet. She would have been in a college orchestra. At Sussex, neither. She never touched a clarinet, because in a unitary university, you have to be very good to be in the university orchestra. In a collegiate university, you just have to be quite good. And I think that difference is the key thing that, in a way, differentiates and justifies the collegiate system, but it is, of course, hugely expensive. But it does allow people to have a go at something in a kind of unthreatened way.
And we've both had a go at something in an unthreatened way, which is my way of winding this up.
Yes.
And your philosophy is something which we generated those 50 years ago together.
Absolutely.
That university was more than work, and about friendship and music and love and so on. So it's been a delight to talk about it. Thank you very much indeed, Dick.
Alan, thank you for the privilege.